Welcome to Cold Start. We're going to continue our conversation about the perfect Porsche. Now, in our last episode, we focused more on the 911. And if you guys didn't catch from our last episode, the Easter egg at the beginning, so our cold start sound actually came from a 993 turbo. Now, if you guys haven't listened to that episode and wonder how we came to the conclusion that the 993 turbo is the perfect 911 Porsche, go ahead and take a listen to that episode. But today we're going to be focusing on the upper side of Porsche. So what is above the 911? These halo cars. You know, I think when people think about Porsche and what is the pinnacle Porsche, a big poster child car for a lot of people is the Carrera GT. And it represents so much for the brand of Porsche. And even today, that car is still relevant and iconic.
Yeah, it's one of those things that just stands the test of time. I think the Carrera GT today is still different than almost everything else that's come out since. It has a lot of elements to it that elevate it into that category, whatever we call that now, special cars, limited edition cars, supercars, and it has a lot of its history sort of which makes it a different car. That's kind of interesting. It's a race car for the road. And a lot of people think that the ultimate expression of any car, not just maybe the 911 that we talked about being usable in all these different circumstances, but a race car for the road is what a lot of people think that they want, or they theorize that's the ultimate expression of a road-going vehicle. And the Carrera GT is effectively that.
I think what's interesting is when you look at a CGT, it was such a step away from what Porsche was doing prior, right? I think there's a lot of focus on the company of building the 911 and rear engine cars, sports cars, and mainly flat sixes. Like that is their typical motor.
Right.
And now here you have this supercar, mid-engined V10 manual transmission, and a lot of people identify as the ultimate analog car, not just the ultimate analog Porsche, but the ultimate analog car. It's such a driver-focused vehicle, and I think a major highlight in the Porsche history. And it has a fascinating background of how it even came to be, because you look at it and you're like, what was Porsche thinking of making such a radical step away from their norm?
Right.
Especially in the mid 2000s.
Yeah, if you think about that limited type of Porsche, really it goes back to the mid 80s when the 911 sort of evolved into what they then called the 959, which if you look at it, you see 911 there with some stuff tacked on, but there was a lot of new technology and new engineering developed for that car in the direction that Porsche would eventually go with their next couple of, special cars like the Carrera GT. But in that same era, in the mid-80s, a lot of people don't know that Porsche was developing F1 engines. Under the name TAG, T-A-G, they made engines for McLaren for, I think, 2 years. And those were the standard six-cylinder turbos that people come to associate with Porsche, the six-cylinder engine. And in 1992, Porsche began working on a V10 engine as a project for an F1 team called Footwork. They got pretty far with its development, and they came near to completing the engine, but the project was canceled by the F1 team. So that engine was sort of just sitting around in the workshop at Porsche for years until the mid to late 90s, when Porsche, who had been active in Le Mans for a very long time with the six-cylinder engines, decided to take that engine and fit it to a Le Mans prototype car, an LMP car, for the LMP 2000 era of LMP. Around that same time in the late 90s, however, Porsche was having a lot of financial problems. And that's what spurred on the development of the Porsche Cayenne, which a lot of people said was a huge departure from their history and their direction and their ethos. But also the Boxster. And so around 2000, they thought they might enter an LMP. They decided not to because of money. However, around the beginning of the 2000s, the finances at Porsche got a lot better. The Cayenne was extremely successful. The Boxster sold a lot of units. They were kind of back. And they looked to the chassis of their Le Mans car from 1998 called the 911 GT1 as sort of the basis for a new prototype that they would build. They took this V10 engine, They put it together and they sort of surprised the world. It was at the 2001 Paris Auto Salon, so the big auto show in Paris. Walter Rorrell, who's known as an amazing driver, rally cars and others, Porsche factory driver, rolls down the Champs-Élysées, like the main drag in Paris, and comes up onto the stage in this thing that looks, effectively like a spaceship, kind of like the GT1, but modified. And it had in it the V10 engine that had been modified from F1 to LMP and now in this prototype of a street car. Nobody expected that it would actually be produced. It looked like a lot of other prototypes you see at auto shows, just a proof of capability. But 2 years later, around 2003, Porsche announced that this would be known as the Model 980, and really unusually, with higher horsepower and higher displacement than the prototype car had. The V10 at that point was a 5.5 liter. They bored it out further to a 5.7 liter. When they announced the car for a 2004 model year car, it was up to over 600 horsepower. So the history of this car coming around was it was based as a race car engine that they eventually took a race car chassis and developed into a street-going car, a road-going car, and then they actually released it, and it kind of blew people away. In 2004, they can go and buy one of these cars from a Porsche dealership.
What I find that's so fascinating of how the CGT came about was, I feel like Porsche is one of those brands that's like very German. They do things with a purpose. And the CGT for me was the first time that the brand ever created something just to create it. If we look back at some of those pinnacle cars that preceded the CGT, the 959, they made it to go rally racing.
Right.
There was a purpose. There was a point. There was a reason why they were spending so much money on creating a special car. And then the GT1 that came after, it was a homologated car. They wanted to go racing in GT1 class racing. But the Carrera GT was built not for homologation. It wasn't built for racing. It was built to do it. It was kind of the leftover parts of the idea that Porsche wanted to go racing. They wanted to do F1 and then Le Mans and then kind of fell short, right?
That's right.
It was a difficult time for the company. And now they're entering into the supercar world almost for the first time, just for the sake to be a part of it. Yeah. And I think that created such an interesting thing with the CGT that it was a standalone product. It wasn't for anything. It was just to do it. I think that was so surprising for Porsche.
Yeah, to your point, the homologation of the GT1, they did produce a very limited number of street cars. They called it the GT1 Strassen version. I think there were maybe like 20 of them or something. The requirements to homologate the car were that they had to produce that many, but they may as well not exist at that point. You couldn't go to a Porsche dealership and buy one. It was a special arrangement kind of thing. So yeah, the Carrera GT was built and I'll say integrated from these parts and then refined into this thing that was intended to be a full standalone car, which made it really unique. Developed for the purpose of being a road car, but at that sort of elevated, limited production sort of way.
Where the CGT was the first time that Porsche made something that was supposed to reminisce a race car for the street, but the production numbers were still limited.
Yeah, they produced 1,200 of those cars, and the story goes, they had a really hard time moving all of these cars off of dealerships when they first came out. The starter price was in the $400,000 range, which was astronomical at the time. If you look back to what other cars cost that, very
bargain today.
But today, if you could get one for that, you'd buy 3 of them, right? But they had that uniqueness to them where they were limited in production, and all of these elements truly made them different than everything else that was available to go buy. Let's talk about maybe some of the things that made it so unique, right? First of all, as a sort of a race car in its origin, it had a carbon fiber monocoque chassis. That makes it incredibly special and different than every other car. There's the way the car was assembled around this carbon fiber structure. Then, of course, that V10 engine, which we talked about at 5.7 liters, I think it was rated at 605 horsepower, second to none compared to anything else that was a production car at that time.
And Porsche still hasn't developed another V10 after this.
That's right. This is the one and only V10 that Porsche ever produced in a road-going car that was originally developed to be for a race car.
Which is so fascinating because it's such a phenomenal motor. Easily within the top 3 best-sounding engines
for sure
in the world. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
you could argue that maybe the LFA has a better note, but the CGT it's the V10 in there is phenomenal.
That's
it
right.
makes the CGT just that much more special that it's the only V10 in a road-going Porsche.
Yeah, and you think about how that thing sounds, the way it revs, revs out to a 8,400 RPM redline. Again, something that was nearly unheard of at the time in a production car. You have this car with a top speed of over 200 miles an hour. It came in a 6-speed transmission, manual transmission only. There was no other option. There was no automatic, no slush box, no Tiptronic. It was paired to this really interesting shifter that was placed nearly on the center of the dash, not as low as most shifters were. They also stuck a wood knob on it. It was a beautiful polished wood knob, but it was hearkening back to the Porsche 917 race car, where they used a wooden, I think it was balsa wood shift knob for lightness, because they didn't want to add too much weight for a big piece of metal stuck on the end of it. So, combining this engine with the sound that revved so high, that shifted using this really unique positioning and feel to a shifter, it made it so unlike everything else that had come before it, and really that has come since, right? And still sticking to that ethos where Porsche designs things on cars for a purpose, not just for a look. I think it was the first Porsche that had the integrated rear actuated wing. So the rear spoiler would actually rise up when you hit at 74 miles per hour on the road to increase downforce. But when you didn't go that fast, it would be tucked down and integrated into the bodywork. So another innovation from this car that now we take for granted, cars that have, this active or at least somewhat passive active aero elements to the car. This trickled down to the 911s that followed it as well.
And there's also, isn't there a button in the car too? So it's, if you wanted to run the wing up, you could.
Yeah, you could put it in boy racer mode anytime you want, or if you want to, service the thing or polish it or what have you. Yeah, you can manually bring the spoiler up, and there's people who do that. It's kind of like popping your collar, maybe. Guys who walk around like that. I think something else that was unique about this car was the clutch. So paired to that 6-speed transmission, the clutch was made, again, we're going back to race car stuff here. This is a non-flywheel car, right? It's shaft driven, like an F1 car is or has been. And so getting that bite point, right, the friction zone of where the clutch engages to get the car rolling was really tricky, and it would stall very easily. And if you've driven any type of race car, those are really hard to get to the right point to get them moving sometimes. So for this to be a consumer car, a production car that anybody can go buy, they need to make it a little easier to use. So back to race car technology, they brought in anti-stall. The anti-stall mechanism would automatically sort of kick in the throttle when you're releasing the clutch to an appropriate point, this kind of and all of a sudden the car propels itself forward, which makes it really weird. You can't put the throttle down when you're letting off the clutch, or you'll defeat the anti-stall, and you'll probably burn up the clutch. The clutch is tiny. I think it's like a 40 millimeter little clutch plate or something like that. So if you were giving it gas before you were ready, that awful smell that you get when you do that incorrectly in a car. And these clutches were so expensive, they were made out of exotic materials. Porsche fitted it with an anti-stall system. To this day, it's one of the things this car is notorious for, is how hard it is to get moving if you don't know what you're doing, how easy it is to damage, and how tricky it can be, even if you know how the car is going to work. Imagine sitting on an incline, you're going to go up a hill, and you start to let out the clutch. In any other car, you're going to give it a little extra gas to make sure you can overcome the gravity, the pull of the car that wants to roll backward. In this car, you just let off the clutch. The anti-stall propels you forward, and you start up that hill, and then you quickly feather on the throttle to get moving. But you don't combine those. And if you do, you find out it's really easy to stall the car.
I think that's like the one key point a lot of people talk about when you talk about the CGT nowadays is the drawback of the clutch. But that's a trade-off of having a race car for the street. We're talking about something that's taking all of Porsche's racing technology and applying it to a street use. And from a motorsport background, when you drive a race car that has a clutch pedal, there's only two ways to get that vehicle moving.
That's right.
Either it's all clutch, no gas. It's going to be a slow departure. Or the alternative, all gas, no clutch. You're going to have a little bit of wheel spin there. Now, when you're living with something on a day-to-day basis where you're going to have to get it moving more than once comparative to a race car, you get it out of pit lane. After that, it's glorious,
Yeah, you can't just do a burnout outside your driveway every single time you want to get moving.
You could. I don't know what your HOA would have to say about that, but doing a burnout in a CGT, I don't think would be frowned upon by anyone. And I think it would maybe keep your clutch a little bit fresher than the alternative. But like you said, they kind of thought a little bit about the daily consumer of with that anti-stall system to kind of help you out. But it's just a quirk of the car. And
Right.
once you get a hang of it, once you get that feel for that clutch pedal, it's really not that intimidating. And once you get the vehicle up to speed, the rest of it is worth it.
The rest of it follows. That's right.
You've been a CGT owner for a handful of years, and I think you know you should share maybe what is one of those moments where that car has really made you feel fulfilled as a driver. Because I feel like not a lot of people get to experience these cars, and even a lot of people that own these cars aren't out there driving them, unfortunately. And I think they're missing a huge piece of that. But what's been one of your highlights with your CG?
Yeah, I mean, everybody talks about the sound, and it's true. The sound of the car connects you to it in such a way, right? We talked in the last episode a little bit about how the sound of the engine revving kind of gives you the feedback that you need to know when to shift, right? That tension you feel in the car when you're near the red line or you're just getting out of the power band and it's time to pull a shift. This car makes that so dramatic, so exciting, and you have that sound coming from right behind your head with the mid-engine car and the exhaust out back. It sounds unlike anything else. And getting to drive one of those cars out on the open road, or even better, through a tunnel, there's nothing that's quite as much fun as that in driving that I've had a chance to do. The handling of the car is amazing. It's a rear-wheel drive car that's super light. The engine's in the middle. It's planted. You put the power down and it goes. You get off the gas and it scrubs off those revs incredibly quick, right? That shaft-driven transmission works that way. So that's part of the fun. Being able to take the tops off and being out there cruising around the coast, driving to Monterey, things like that, it make it an amazing experience, right? It's recognizable. People see that car who know what that is and they know it's special. They want to approach you. They want to talk about the car. They want to find out what it's like. They want to understand what's a myth and what's the reality of living with this car. That uniqueness brings experience in all kinds of ways. You meet a lot of interesting people driving around in a car like that, and people want to see it and talk about it and know more about the car, and sometimes more about you. Maybe that's even a little bit of downside on occasion. Sometimes you'd like to be able to go enjoy your car and not have to entertain other people or have a conversation about the thing. You just want to go use it. It makes you a little bit of a target in that way. So maybe that's even a downside of the experience of owning it. It is a race car for the road. And as much as we talk about that as sort of this idealized condition, it has its drawbacks. There's a reason we don't drive race cars on the road other than not being road legal. They're highly sprung, right? They rev them up, they rev back down. You need to be careful. Those are things that most people aren't doing on the road most of the time.
Has there ever been a moment that it's scared you? I guess, has it ever tried to bite?
Yeah, I would say there have been occasions where if you get on the gas too aggressively, the rear end will kick out on you. It is rear wheel drive with 605 horsepower and it revs up fast. So if you're not prepared for the rate of which it will rev out or your tires aren't warm or it's not the best conditions for those tires, the back end can kick out. And so being able to recover from that is a moment. Fortunately, those moments have been few and far between and have been able to recover from those. I've had some of those moments on the racetrack. So this is a car that is capable on the racetrack as well. In fact, behind the seats is a little bracket to put in racing harnesses that came with the car. I didn't have to install a roll cage
From the factory.
from the factory. You just remove this panel and you're able to install the 6-point harnesses directly. So being able to kind of hop in your car and drive it on the track, pop your helmet on and go is fantastic. But it also allows you to take some more chances than you might in other circumstances. And I've been in that moment where I got on the gas aggressively and the back end kicked out and I had to recover from that. I haven't actually spun this car, but I got close. And it was a moment because my life and my bank account flashed before my eyes to realize what would happen if this didn't go well. Fortunately, it was at a track. There was a lot of space. Happened to be at Thunderhill West at the time. So there's a lot of room. There's very few hard things to hit. I was able to gather it back up and continue my driving. But I definitely had that moment of tension, of wondering what might happen if this does go as badly as it seemed like it might for a minute.
Do you find it to be a challenging car to drive on the track? So I feel like not a lot of people with CGTs are out there putting the car on the track. So there's not a lot of people that can speak on what the car acts like at the limit.
Yeah, I've driven this car on the track with the street setup, right, with street tires and the stock wheels, which are great, but are limited compared to what you'd have on a slick tire. There are people who have put slicks on these cars, but that's a whole other thing. So there is a limit there of what the car will be able to do in terms of traction and grip. Going into a turn, sometimes you want to try to get a little bit of that drift. You want to let the car exceed the grip of the tire to get that slip angle and really maximize things. Kind of afraid to, got to be honest. You get to that point where the car starts to slide out from under you. It's really easy to go too far. I've probably backed down from that 10/10ths driving in those circumstances because of the limitations of the street tire.
The CGT was more limited by the tire, not necessarily what the car could do. It almost yearned for a race tire.
Yeah, in fact, there's this recent service bulletin that came out for the Carrera GT to address some suspension parts from factory. But as part of that package, they've actually developed a new tire for this car. So in 2024, they announced there's a new tire technology, an N0 rated tire that they finally have developed for the Carrera GT. All this time, we've been driving on Michelin Super Sports, not Pilot Sports, not PS2s, not the tires you imagine that are on a lot of performance road cars these days. It's a tire that was developed for a 2004 car, and you could still get them, but now there's a new tire option available, which will give you increased capability, more like what people are used to getting out of their 911, for example, that they can take to the track. So that'll increase its capability and reduces this limitation in how you can potentially push the car to near its limits. But I have not found the car to be the limit. It's the driver, it's the tire, it's the conditions for sure.
Was it fun on track, or were you more concerned of don't mess things up?
Both. It was a blast. Okay. To drive down the straight and hear the car and the engine roaring and having that experience was fantastic. Going into that first turn at speed, the brakes, they're super capable. They're ceramic brakes, but they're early technology ceramics. And a lot of you know, you got to get heat into the brakes for them to work. So if you haven't prepared, you're going to have a bad moment if you just stomp on the brakes after going 150 mile an hour down a straight. So it's a little unnerving. You need to be thinking about things. The repercussions of a crash. Nobody drives to crash, whether that's a street car or a race car, but the Carrera GT, even though it's a carbon fiber tub, is not designed to tear off a corner. It's not designed to damage bodywork. It's not designed to be put back together in the way a race car is. So that's a limitation at the track and something that's in the back of your mind. I know really nobody I've ever met who's had one of these cars treated it like a disposable item or an item that they wanted to see go through that process. So there's that voice in the back of your mind saying, don't crash it, that most of us have in all of our cars on the racetrack. But in particular, it's a very loud voice driving this car down the track because it's so capable. You can get in trouble really quickly. It can get away from you.
And I feel like to an extent that might somewhat take away from these cars that are so high up there, where they're designed to drive phenomenally and give you this amazing experience. But then again, they're so unobtainable, and I'm sure Porsche doesn't have a whole lot of extra CGT parts because they're not too concerned of people taking them to the track. But it was a car that was designed for that. So it's kind of a shame that there's this aura around it, that it's this uber collectible, want holy grail type thing that discourages people from actually using them. And I mean, this is a big overarching topic, but maybe that's something that takes away a little bit from the CGT itself. Of it's gotten into this uber collectible market. I mean, CGT prices have gone crazy. The market, like you talked about, the MSRP of those things was 400,000. Now add a 1 in front of that
at
number.
least.
And I think they're only going north from here. As we see things progress, these analog vehicles are becoming more and more and increasingly more collectible, which means, unfortunately, you're not going to see as many CGTs out in the wild, let alone on a racetrack getting used in a manner in which they were designed.
That's right. Most of them, they stay in a garage. They get out for special drives, for cars and coffee, or for showing off in Monterey. Very few of them are being driven to their capability, to their limit, used on the track, even used out on the road. And you have to worry about other people out on the road, out on the freeway. So that's understandable to some extent. This is a limited thing. They're not making any more of them. But at the same time, it does potentially limit the enjoyment you can get out of this thing because you couldn't use it in all the circumstances that you might want to.
So kind of going off of that, I know we talked a little bit about, when you drive it out and kind of become somewhat of a celebrity, right? People want to know who you are. Tell me about your car, that whole deal, which I think anyone that has an interesting car has been there once or twice. Probably happened a lot more if you're in a CGT. But going off of that, maybe what are some of the other drawbacks or not the favorable experiences you've had?
Yeah, well, I'll say, race car for the road sounds great. We've talked about some of the things that are a little less practical. The suspension is stiff. It's set up to be a race car. It's got an inboard suspension, which is really interesting and unusual for a production car, but the ride's a little rough. And, for me, one of the things I thought would be a really fun thing to do is, drive around in this car with my girl on my side, right? With my wife with me. And she hates to ride in this car. The seats aren't comfortable. The ride quality isn't comfortable. If there's a bump, you feel it, So it makes it hard to enjoy with all the people that you might want to enjoy the car with, which is sort of a bummer. That's maybe there's this dream of using the car a certain way, but the reality doesn't always live up to it.
Could be a selfish driver if you own a CGT.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what this is. It's a driver's car. It's not a passenger's car. Yes, you can have a passenger, but just like a lot of race cars, you might be able to fit one in there, but they're not going to have a good time of it. And it's easy to stall. I'll admit readily, probably 1 out of every 3 times I go out somewhere on a drive, I get up to that intersection and I just didn't remember, or I didn't, calculate right, and I got onto the throttle and it defeated the anti-stall and I stalled. It gets a little unnerving. You're like, this thing's going to kick in, right? This anti-stall feature, and it doesn't seem like it's kicking in. Am I just going to stall the engine? And it psychs you out. And I've had that happen several times, even though I know fully well what to do. There's that experience, and man, you feel like a goober when you're at that intersection. People are looking at your flashy car, and you're like, oh, you don't even know how to drive it. You stalled the thing, and well, it's a little special that way. And anyway, another practicality of it is the getting tires and wheels on and off of this car. Most cars these days have an area where you jack up under the car. These cars come with jack plates. So it's a little piece of metal that, to save weight, they didn't pre-install underneath the car. You have to have them with you or get them to you to put under the car to install in order to be able to jack up the car. So there's a little bit of this chicken and egg problem. The car's really low to the ground. How are you going to install your jack plates? You need to put it up on a lift. Well, how are you going to get it on the lift without the jack plates? So there's this procedural thing where you got to get nice and low to the ground to install these pieces of metal onto the car in order to even be able to jack it up to get a tire off. It is center lock, so we have all the issues with needing the extra long breaker bar and torque wrench to get the center lock wheels off of the car. A lot of the cars, especially with the ceramics, you have to be so careful with the rotors doing that. You need somebody pressing down the brake pedal while you're doing that, or you need a rig to be able to do that for you while you're getting the wheel off the car. So if you wind up with a flat tire, now what? You're getting on a flatbed. Somebody's going to want to jack up your car. You're going to have to tell them, no, don't do that. You're going to hurt the carbon fiber tub, and that costs more than both of us have right now to fix.
These all seem like reasons as to why maybe CGT owners don't drive their cars that much. It's the daily use drawbacks. And I think most CGT owners kind of fall into that category of it's part of a collection. They almost look at it as the CGT as more of a investment. It's an entity that's going to increase in price.
Yeah, I think a lot of people think of cars that way. I don't personally. I believe deeply that cars were made to drive, and that's what they're for. Some cars will appreciate over time. There's very few cars that are really, excuse the pun, but investment vehicles. If you look at the appreciation of a vehicle over time, very, very infrequently, maybe a handful of examples that are notable, is that appreciation greater than other ways that you would invest your money and get a return. Now, it's a lot more fun to have a car and this thing that you can use, but every time you use it, you potentially detract from that investment, that appreciation that if people are buying it for that car, it defeats, which is why those cars sit in garages and museums and don't get used. So it's sort of a shame. This thing that was built to be a car and built to be used just sits as an object versus an actual car.
And as these cars keep increasing in prices, it gives you more and more of a reason not to drive it. Keep the miles down, keep the collectability up, things of that nature. But kind of looking at, you've had the car for a couple years, looking at the journey that you've had with it, maybe where the market is now comparative to when you got it, would you do it again?
I think the timing was such that I got into it at a point where I could. I think given where things are now, I wouldn't do it. The expense of that car, even for what you get now, if you think about having that much in a single item and an asset, there's a lot at stake. How much so many people associate that car with a price tag. It wasn't quite that way when I got into this car. Sure, it was an expensive car compared to a lot, but it wasn't one of those things that the first thing a person asks you when they see the car is, how much is that car? What do you do for a living? How much money do you make? I don't want to answer those questions. I don't know anybody who really does.
Right.
You have to be a real exhibitionist to go out there and try to put that in people's faces to say like, oh, I must have a lot, or my circumstances must have been such that I am fortunate enough to be able to do this. It was just a really cool performance car that looked awesome and had all these qualities to it. But now it's become this unobtainable thing, this price-driven thing, this sort of celebrity creating thing. I still would want the experience to drive it. I would love the opportunity to do so. Living with it is a different circumstance.
But you're the type of person that loves to drive. You're driving focused when it comes to ownership of vehicles. And I mean, I share that same sort of mentality of, if you're going to own something, use it. And if you don't use it, don't own it. But yeah, it makes sense. Like, if you're afraid to use a car or have more reasons or excuses not to take a car out than you do to take a car out, at what point is that trade-off no longer make sense? There's no longer that value in it. And I think it brings up this interesting discussion that the Carrera GT is for sure the ultimate analog Porsche, and in a way, the ultimate Porsche, and what it represents and what it brings to the table and the experience that it provides. But kind of like we were talking about in our 911 discussion about the ultimate driving vehicle, the ultimate driving Porsche, maybe the CGT falls short just because of what it brings to the table and its collectability and its value to the market takes away from the peace of mind to use it. And even on track, you're not driving it and enjoying the drive. And that's all that you're thinking about. You're driving and enjoying it, right? Because there's no way that you can't enjoy a CGT. But there's that other piece of your mind that's the value, and it's been on a track, and there could be a rock chip, and how am I going to get the rubber marks off? And what if something happens to it, and this, that, the other? And it's, well, that's not enjoyable. That's not 100% enjoyable.
It's that thing. I don't want to downplay it. I mean, it's an awesome car. It's been fun to drive. It's amazing to be out in. It sounds fantastic, but it's also sort of frustrating. It's like you have this thing that can do all this stuff, but most of the time you can't do that with it. You're worried. You're concerned about what might happen, and it doesn't drive well at a slow speed, right? The car lugs at low RPMs. It's a race car. It wants to get up and go. And it's not always time to drive a race car when you're out on the road. So it makes it this, I'll say, sort of frustrating experience at times. And it's amazing when you can uncork it and go. But how many times have you gone out for an amazing drive on PCH only to be behind bicycles and trucks the whole time? And you never get above 25 miles an hour. And sure, you can enjoy the scenery, but you wanted to kind of let her go a little bit. You wanted to put the gas down, and you couldn't. And you come back like, well, that could have been awesome. And it was still fun, but it wasn't everything it could have been. And so that's what I'm talking about. I don't want to downplay this. This is a cool car, but there's things about it in a practical circumstance that make it hard to use in all the ways that we would want to use it.
I think that CGT, I don't think it falls short of its reputation. I think just now in the modern market, you're not able to reach that expectation anymore. You're not able to reach the full potential of the car because of those external factors of it's a collector's item. It's a painting. It's a sculpture at this point. It's a quote unquote investment of the well-off. It's just something you get, you store away, and then because of its reputation, it's going to increase in value. But at one day, there's going to be a point where all these CGTs are stuck in garages and no one's driving them.
Yeah, which is a shame, right? They weren't made to be that. They were made to be driven. They were made to be a car that people could buy and go use. But when that comes at such a cost, whether it's dollars or other things, there's some downsides. We have to admit that. It's amazing. It's phenomenal. Every superlative we could think of, you could apply to this vehicle.
Absolutely.
But it also comes with these other things that people generally gloss over and don't talk about so much, and is a reality of actually owning and using the vehicle on a day-to-day.
Well, thanks, Todd. This has been Cold Start.
Thanks, Silas. This is a lot of fun. Thanks for listening. Oh, by the way, perhaps you noticed the sound at the beginning of this episode. That's a cold start from a Carrera GT.